to FIDM's ongoing series, The Future of. The topic we're talking about this month is Omnichannel Retail. I am Tom Henkenius, the co-chair of FIDM's Bachelor's in Digital Marketing and Graphic Design, as well as Visual Communications. If you subscribe to the eMarketer Retail by the Numbers daily email like I do, then you open your inbox to this just this morning. In the US, e-commerce sales are set to make up about 15% of total retail sales this year. And depending on where you look, you'll see some different numbers, but let's stay with eMarketer just to be consistent. And take a look at this next number, which shows e-commerce sales worldwide in the year 2022. Obviously, a bit of a projection here. They're saying 20% of total sales will be e-commerce. And hopefully by now, we're all aware that the lockdowns of 2020 shot e-commerce sales through the roof, up 26% at the time in 2020 itself. But what goes up, of course, must also come down. And this chart shows you the slowing growth that we're seeing in 2022. And actually, April's retail numbers showed in-store sales up 10%, e-commerce down 1.8% year over year. So now we see retailers adjusting. And here's a few of the recent headlines that caught my attention. I think for me, the most jarring was just over a year ago now, but this one from Hudson Bay Company, parent of Saks, and Saks off Fifth, planning to separate and have since separated their e-commerce business from their brick and mortar operations. Kohl's, meanwhile, just announced a new store format that they're rolling out, smaller stores with zones for diverse female-owned brands, self-return, self-checkout, goal of having a Kohl's within 15 miles of every American. Interesting. WWD recently made the argument that experiential flagships are the next big thing for luxury retailers. Bit of a throwback here, don't you think? So we see some retailers turning toward the brick while others focus on the click. I want to bring your attention to something that Chip Bergh, president and CEO of Levi's, told WWD ahead of its investor day just last month. And that is by 2027, they want to triple direct-to-consumer e-commerce sales, moving it to 55% of total revenue. We saw a similar move by Nike a couple of years ago. And then let's just briefly touch on technology. Both Apple, Shopify, adding tech that will make the in-store shopping experience easier. Shopify especially is the one that's catching my eye as they're pushing their POS system to unify your brick and click transactions. Apple, though, just last week announcing that they're doing the tap to pay on iPhone. So you can pay iPhone to iPhone, specifically targeting that at small business owners. Oh, by the way, there's also something called inflation that's at its highest level in 40 years. Just an afterthought now, right? Not exactly. That's the lay of the land as we begin this conversation with two really smart guys that I'm excited to talk to, and I hope you're excited to hear from. Joining us shortly will be Patrick Hernig. If you don't know him, you've certainly heard of the companies he's founded. He launched 11 Monterey, the first of its kind luxury shopping destination for the plus size marketplace. He then co-founded 13 Loon, which is a beauty retail destination committed to the amplification of BIPOC people, founded with investors like Gwyneth Paltrow, Sean Combs, Glenn Renfrew of Beauty Counter. Our first guest is a FIDM alum, retail champion with a very impressive background. He's a highly accomplished retail exec, leading the field teams at companies like Gap and Apple, West Elm. Ron wrote his first best-selling book, Retail Pride, in 2020, and has shared his story of how he got into the retail business. I love the subheading of this, Guide to Celebrating Your Accidental Career. We'll get to that in just a second or so. But I think it's interesting to point out that he's also living in an Airstream right now and on a tour of the country. You're in month 2, if I'm not mistaken, Ron, and driving cross country, the point of which, as we were talking about this earlier this week, is to meet with retailers where they're at. And before I really want to get into those trends I just talked about, I kind of want to know more about this drive itself, the point of it, what you're hoping to learn as you crisscross the country and chat with these retailers.
Sure. Hi, Tom. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. Yes, I'm coming to you live from Austin, Texas, where it is north of 100 degrees. So I am trying to stay cool in my aluminum home as we speak here. But the goal here, and I can back up for a moment, is after spending 30 plus years working in retail post my FIDM experience, I just discovered more and more how important it is, not just for the teams I've led and for the great brands I've worked for, but as an industry, when you quote those numbers, Tom, around 80+% of all commerce. So I reverse that. When I hear 20%, 25%, even 15 is e-com, my answer to that is yes, but 80% of all revenue generated still comes out of a store. And in order to do that, the retail industry is the biggest private sector employer in the country and employs 1 out of 4 people in the US and a very significant number all over the world. And I look at that and I say, I love what I've done leading brands, but more importantly, the only way that this industry will continue to thrive and grow, and there isn't a report that says e-commerce is going to be bigger than brick and mortar, probably for as long as we're living. It's just not. I'm happy to see Levi's saying we want to grow e-commerce by 40%. That's great. But as someone who has now spent 2 months traveling across the country, brick and mortar retail is the foundation of how this country was built. And everything happens in a store. And in order for this to continue to be great, we have to celebrate the people doing that frontline work. And so I wanted to go on this tour, and the only way I could do it, I had been living in New York City for a decade, spent most of my life in LA, and said, I can only do this on the road. And hey, could we do this in an Airstream? My husband and I just said, hey, could we actually live remotely for a year, which turned into me having some great conversations with brands like Spotify Advertising and Ubic and KWI, who said, we'd love to help you do this. And so this has turned into a year-long adventure of, a podcast and book. I have a book signing tonight here in Austin and events in every city and all kinds of exciting things happening, primarily to celebrate the work that's happening in frontline retail today.
If I hear you right, kind of reading between the lines, you're talking about culture and culture for retail as a profession. And if I'm understanding the work you're doing, you're saying that it has to start within the corporation and then trickled up into the profession. I think about, lawyers have a culture, business people have a culture, and a lot of that is established in business school or in law school. And I'm also kind of thinking about how there's all these trends we just pointed toward that are going on, headwinds that the industry's yet to confront probably in the remainder of 2022. How do you connect culture with all the things that are going on? How do you build that? Are we at a point where we can't even convince owners to focus on it?
Oh, interesting. I love this question because culture's it's such a big word and it's so hard to define. And I think to your comment earlier around my intent of the subtitle of my book being The Guide to Celebrating Your Accidental Career, that came directly from nearly hundreds, if not thousands of people that I've met as I've traveled brick and mortar stores in my career. I've opened dozens, if not hundreds of stores. I have led brands that were in the boom of opening brick and mortar retail. And the majority of people would sit down in front of me and I would say, hey, tell me about you, tell me your story. And they would say, I never intended to work in retail. And by doing that, though, when I think how that impacts our culture, because this is an industry that's so self-taught, and while I went to FIDM and maybe many people watching today did, you learn the majority of how to do this job well as a retailer, as a stock associate, sales, leadership, multi-store leadership. I worked in corporate visual merchandising for Gap. You learn these jobs on the job. There's no replacement for that. So culturally, you say, I kind of ended up in this by accident, and I'm learning this work on the job. So what that requires as a culture is brands have to do what's important, the important work, which is providing training and development programs and resources and tools and technology so that people continue to join the industry, and that this is a very important and fruitful career with endless amounts of brands and jobs and financial opportunities. But it requires brands to do the right thing, and it requires all of us to say, you know what, maybe this wasn't so accidental after all. And funny enough, people often say to me, I didn't choose retail, retail chose me. And that's kind of a joke in a way of like, I never really wanted to do this, but I love it. And I just flip that around and say, but as a culture, then as a retail industry, if we're going to say 1 in 4 people work in this, that's not an accident. And when you have intention behind what you do and you say, I love working in retail. It's the first line on the back of my book. Ron Thurston loves retail. And when you say that, then you inherently are more intentional about what you do. And you say, this is my career. And therefore, I'm going to choose great brands and great leaders and that align with my personal values. And it's this whole conversation about an almost under-celebrated industry. And I used pride in a very intentional way, that word. That word has many meanings for many people. As a gay man, I have my own relationship with the word, but those two words have never been put together. Retail pride didn't exist until I wrote this book. And so our idea of how do we use language that celebrates our choices that include retail. So for me, I could talk to you for an hour on this topic, but the joy of touring the country already and meeting with brands, meeting with teams, meeting with people that come for me to sign their book, they're so joyous about working in this industry. And that is something that's not in the news often. And I want to
pull on a thread that you mentioned, and that is this piece about being intentional about your career choices. Again, to compare it back to somebody graduating from business school or law school, right? They're very intentional about that first job, about the internships that they get while they're there, because that's going to lead to their first employment. And so thinking about how that aligns with you, right? And at this point, I'm talking to the people who are watching our broadcast here because we're the ones working in this industry. What are the best brands you're seeing doing right now?
So I think some of the best, and I use that word loosely because I very much believe that there are great brands that execute well most of the time via great store managers. And there are great brands that maybe execute poorly via poor leadership in those stores. And I've seen it already in my tour. I've been in multiple Targets, I've been in multiple Walmarts, I've been in Home Depots, I've been in some of the biggest brands, and they're highly inconsistent in their execution. So you would say Target and Walmart have these extraordinary leadership training programs, and I celebrate that. But it comes down to execution within the 4 walls in your local business, in your local city. And so I think those brands that have said, we don't have enough people to grow our business at the rate of which is growing. To your point earlier, brick and mortar retail is growing. Store counts are growing. We're at the highest number of stores, over 1 million brick and mortar retail businesses in this country right now. It's the highest it's ever been. Yet we don't have enough people to work. And so those brands are investing in technology and training and training programs for career development. The best brands are doing that. And I think some of the kind of family smaller brands also have opportunities to use technology like Ubic or some of these that provide exceptional training and development programs in the palm of your hand. That's available to all and would welcome the growth sometimes of, you don't have to create it, it already exists. You can just kind of plug into some greatness happening in the industry.
From the employee side now, I'd like to switch to the customer side, and you sort of brought it up a little bit in your discussion there, about Target, and you walk into one store and it looks totally different from the other. I will tell you the one for me that's driving me nuts lately, and it's Macy's. There's so much inconsistency in a brand that I want to love and adore, right? Because it's so storied in American history and culture, and Miracle on 34th Street and all these things. So we call it at the college, the buzz term is CX, customer experience. What are the brands that are taking innovative approaches to CX that you like? Are you seeing new, like somebody setting the bar at a new level? What are you seeing on the road?
So I'm seeing sometimes brands with high store counts that are by market even better than other parts of the country. So I was just in Dallas last week. I met with the team from Lovesac, and Lovesac, there's an intention when you visit a Lovesac. You either want one of their big original sacks, or they have some of the most interesting technology built into sofas from a movie watching gaming experience that I've ever seen. And so the product's really interesting, but then you go in and you see people who are so honored to work there and to sell the product that they do, and the investment that memories make in furniture, and they have great tenure. And so there's this pocket of, I've met with every store manager in Dallas. It was just so joyous. 2 hours into it, we did a breakfast with Ron, and I didn't want to leave. I'm like, I want to stay here and work with you guys. It was so fun. And so it's just one example of, there isn't a brand that I would tell you in every city is doing it right. I think there are brands that have very great intent that require every single detail of communication down to every part-time person. That requires extraordinary effort, but there are brands that are really trying to do this well, and I give them a lot of credit, and there are brands that aren't, and I don't want to name them because that's not my intent, but some of those brands are the ones that are screaming the most loudly about open jobs, and no one wants to work in retail, and it's so hard to hire good people. If one more person tells me that, I'm going to scream. It's not hard to hire great people. Great people work for great leaders and great brands. Yeah. And either be a great leader and attract people, or be a great brand that attracts the best talent, because great people, talented people, want to work around other talented people. And so don't come to me and say that you can't hire. It's entirely self-inflicted. And I know that's a very aggressive statement, but in many ways it's true, because this retail has been the first one to raise our arms and scream that no one wants to work in retail. And it's just not true. And it's a headline that I've been battling, because the people that I've met, both in my career, in a decade in New York City leading brands, and the last 3 months on the road, extraordinarily happy, excited people to work in this business.
I just want to underline what you just said, and maybe put it in your next book. But great people work for great leaders and great brands, and it's so true. And it's really it's interesting. I've been chatting with some brands recently as well, and that is I've never put it as succinctly as you just did, but that's the underline and the headline for that piece of the sort of crisis we're moving through right now as a retail industry. The other crisis to kind of talk about a little bit was the one we just went through, that's still ongoing. We keep saying we're past the pandemic, but it's still impacting us, and it's still impacting what the employees out on the front line are doing. In fact, that's the right word we started using, right? At the beginning of the pandemic, these were our frontline workers. They were in the grocery stores, they were in retail outlets. Right. It placed them, in my mind, in the same breath as first responders, which I thought was a very empowering moment for our industry. And then came the attacks because of mask enforcement and the morale issues. And I think now we're seeing some issues associated with pay and the unionization movement that we're seeing in Starbucks and some of the Amazon plants. When you put all of those pieces together for these frontline workers, was the pandemic a net positive or a negative for a retail worker?
In many ways, I think it's a net positive, because it put the power back into the hands of the employee. And the employee now can say, I've had X number of years in the industry. I'm really good at what I do. These are the competencies that I'm most soaring in. This is what's important to me, and have an observation about how certain companies handled the pandemic. And so now you have a choice. There are far more jobs than there are people today. And so someone looking for a role can say, what's important to me is who's on your board of directors. How does the company represented in a diversity category that's important to you? What are they doing from a sustainability standpoint? Who's leading the company? What training programs do you use? What technology do you have? And you should ask those questions going into the job. And so that power is back in the hands of people those great people that want to work for other great leaders have a choice. And that for me is really exciting. And it's put the brands on the defensive to say, wow, like we need to do better and we need to make changes. And some of this union conversation is a direct result of them not always doing the right thing. And so today we've got lots of growth opportunities, a booming business, a high store count, projected growth, new brands happening all the time, and people who have a choice. And so I would just say, as I often do, like be the brand that companies want to work, that these people want to work for. And there are a lot of ways you can do that. And it's not by trying to be good at everything, but be good at what's important to you and what's important to your team. And from there, it will continue to grow. When I was in North Carolina in Asheville, I met with the cycling brand who moved all of their production from overseas to Old Fort, North Carolina, and built a factory in North Carolina, taught and hired almost 100 people and taught them how to sew and put all their production back locally. And now they only produce what's sold on the website with a three-day turnaround. So they have no excess inventory. They have 100% full price business. They have nothing goes to landfill. They have no extra fabric, none of it. And that's a brand that someone wants to work for. You've done the right thing from the environment. You're creating new skills. You have training programs and classes to teach people new skills. They built a cafe and a restaurant. They built a retail store. All of that. If I lived in Old Fort, North Carolina, I would want to work there. And I would want to work side by side with that CEO who is making smart choices. And I think the industry could use more of that, and a little less of sometimes the things that grab the headlines.
It's a good place to pivot to, Patrick, because I think what you're referring to is ESG, environmental social governance, which has been the big discussion point at the moment. Ron will rejoin us in a few minutes to take questions. So please make sure you use the Q&A button. That's the one we'll be looking at for your questions at the end of our time together. Ron, thank you. Excellent to speak with you. I do want to turn to Patrick Hernig, though. He's the founder of 11 Honoré and 13 Loon, as I mentioned. Patrick, I wonder if we can just pick up right there where we left off with Ron. Clearly, you've made a business case for inclusivity, for ESG, which has become such the buzz term in the last couple of months. What do you think has been the key to your success in this space? Where I mean, honestly, it doesn't feel like it's just performative, that you actually have a stake in it, that you're really doing something meaningful around it.
Look, I think for me, it's less about it being part of the cultural zeitgeist and more about, and I forget the exact quote, it's always the right time to do the right thing. And so whether it be through the lens of inclusivity, size inclusivity through 11 Honoré, or the representation of BIPOC founded beauty brands through 13 Loon, it is, retail is evolving, right? And the narrative of inclusivity is weaving a thread through the entire conversation. And now more than ever, priorities around diversity and inclusivity are more important than they ever have been. And prior to the racial reckoning in the summer of 2020 and the passing of George Floyd, we broke through, in my humble opinion, we broke through the glass ceiling when it came to, you're no longer seeing all white Instagram accounts, you're no longer seeing all white boardrooms, you're no longer seeing all white press trips, you're no longer seeing all white ad campaigns. And with that shift, that major shift, certainly as it trickles through brand and retail, you have to be paying attention to this. You have to have an initiative. You have to have it be a priority. And it just so happens that these are businesses that are rooted in that to begin with. So there hasn't been any pivoting. It's always started with inclusivity from day one. And so it's just exciting to see the rest of the industry catch up.
I was interested, you told me the other day that it's not just about inclusivity, though. It's also just as a business, it's about doing something that's never been done before. How did you go about finding that piece of the puzzle, right? The inclusivity piece is relatively simple in that sense, but then where do you get the piece that's like never been done before?
Yeah, that's, less so about 13 Loon, though the premise had never been done before. The product existed. With 11 on Array, the product didn't exist. So yes, to your point, the area of inclusivity is really the easy part, but then it was mobilizing the fashion brands to get on board with extended sizing. And so, there's this expression in the startup community, building the plane while flying it. And that was very much 11 on Array. We came up with the concept, we launched the platform. Certainly some brands had experience with extended sizing, whether it be through private appointments with private clients or trunk shows, grading up to 16, 18. But to do it at scale, going up to a size 24, the double-edged sword of 13 Loon, of 11 on Array, was, yes, creating it for the first time, but then you were asking brands to create it for the first time. So everybody was creating everything for the very first time. And there were a lot of challenges with just product, but we managed to work through it.
Your brand seemed to have been built with the bricks and clicks in mind. I'm curious if that was the actual case, or did you have to kind of, as you say, build the plane as you flew it?
11 on Array was much more of an iterative process as we got into the Omni approach strategy, and that was really developed accidentally through a fundraising effort in 2021. And through that initiative, we launched really our omnichannel strategy, bringing the 11 on Array private label collection into Nordstrom. So 11 on Array was conceived purely as a digital play. We saw tons of success through what we called client services, which was bringing our product to showrooms. So there was definitely an IRL component to it, but true omnichannel wasn't really part of the conversation or growth strategy until 2021. Learning from that, right, and applying that methodology and strategy to 13 Loon, we always knew, private label was going to be critically important to the business from a healthy margin perspective, and two, we were always positioning the business to have a multi-channel retail distribution approach. And it was really through the conversations that started 90 days after launch with JCPenney that opportunity became full circle, right? So we knew bricks were important. We didn't know when bricks were going to come into the conversation. They came into the conversation very, very early. And so we've truly built 13 Loon really almost from day one as a pure play omnichannel strategy.
When you think about that move now, omnichannel versus just a straight D2C type company, can you build a D2C company? Can you only survive if you're omnichannel?
I think it's what one's definition of success ultimately looks like from a growth perspective. So you can absolutely have a pure play direct to consumer business selling t-shirts and grow modestly. But I think if you have significant initiatives and expectations around big picture revenue goals, I think it becomes increasingly more and more challenging to just have a D2C relationship with the customer. D2C is incredibly important. You own margin, you own brand narrative, you own that relationship with the customer. And so creating that initially is really, really important. But in the background, having your overall strategy taken into consideration while you're building that initial direct-to-consumer relationship with your customer is really, really important. Because if you know you're ultimately going to go into a traditional omni-channel brick and mortar environment, from day one. It helps inform everything from pricing to retail partners to activating IRL, whatever it may be. And so it doesn't necessarily have to begin Omni. It just, the understanding of how you plan to grow, if you know that from day one, it just sets you up for long-term success. And that's certainly what we're seeing. You know, we launched December of 2020 at 13 Loon. Our first brick and mortar doors with JCPenney launched end of 21, but we're not hitting meaningful scale until the fall of this year. So almost 2 years after launching direct to consumer, we'll have a meaningful physical footprint through JCP.
As I think about some of the, you know, sort of darling brands that grew up during the pandemic and even just pre-pandemic, they all seem to have a retail presence, a brick and mortar presence now. You know, whether it's Warby Parker, I think about, you know, I got into Harry's was my razor of choice for a minute. I thought I was so cool, the ordering it online, and they had a delivery service, and now they're in Costco. Like I mean, it seems like you just can't live without it.
Well, look at the numbers, right? The data that you shared when this conversation started. You know, at scale, it's only going to be 20% of all transactions are e-commerce. And so I don't think any business doesn't want to participate in that remaining 80%. And so it really just, it's a balancing act. But I think the thought process behind the brands that were born out of the 2010s, it was just a different time. You know, customer acquisition costs were different. Navigating the Facebook landscape from an advertising perspective was different. You know, things have changed, and as things have changed, right, those pure play D2C startups from the early days, like, had that been able to scale and maintain itself, then sure, everything would be direct to consumer. But those costs got so prohibitive from profitable growth that, like, you have to look at things differently now. And so I give so much credit to those early day brands, those early days brands, because they created this new category. But now us coming up sort of 10 years after that, just have a more cohesive approach to distribution, because staying just in one lane, look, and people often reference an Amazon or, you know, a Kardashian, sure, but Amazon is decades old, and Kardashians, though it's digital, have their own channel of distribution, which is social media. So even those mega influencers are omni-channel, right? And so I just think having being able to sort of assess your business from day one, like, okay, we're launching, this is going to be the use of proceeds, this is how we're going to scale, this is how we're going to hit profitability, this is our omni-channel approach. Like, it's just one of the pillars of your business that you have to think about from day one.
It seems like the most obvious thing, but I think what you've really made me think about is it goes back to that basic business school, you know, the theory of TAM, SAM, SOM, your total accessible market, your segmented accessible, I can't remember all of them, but, like, right? Like, at the end of the day, to your point, and I think I'm coming back to it because I want to make sure everybody gets this. If you've limited yourself to just that 20%, then your total accessible market is nothing compared to if you did the omni-channel strategy, which is so, it's just so genius to think of it that way. Clearly, you're very good at this startup thing. 2 years to scale is relatively quick, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm curious what's getting you excited at the moment, you know, either category or, you know, we talked a little bit before about CX. Like, what is getting you excited right now? What are you paying attention to?
I think what I'm most excited with, that really just, like, emotionally excites me, is through the vehicle of 13 Loon entering JCP, we are accelerating BIPOC founded beauty brands getting to scale faster, right? And so that, and the relationships I've developed with these founders and the opportunity this has afforded their businesses, like, that gets me really excited. It's like we're creating an entirely new product offering that nobody else and any other retail entity in the United States has outside of JCPenney. And so that exclusivity, that excitement, that true intention and integrity and authenticity behind what we're building and that being amplified through the JCP partnership, like that gets me really, really excited, because you can do right and do good at the same time. And that to me is like the fundamental example that 13 Lunas set, right? This isn't about a small business. We're going to grow 1,700% this year. That is massive growth. And we're also like on the right side of the inclusivity conversation. So like they're not mutually exclusive anymore. And so that gets me really, really excited. We've developed our own product, Relevant, which is Nikeo, my co-founder's second beauty brand. That's getting me really, really excited. What else is getting me excited? I think JCPenney's, I'm coining, I'm stealing their tagline, shopping is back. I think that's exciting. The consumer loves an IRL experience, myself as well. And so to have that back in our lives is really, really exciting. I think there's a lot to be concerned about. This is a really scary time, whether it be the war in Ukraine, our problem with gun control, the rolling back of LGBTQ rights. There's a lot that's really frightening on a cellular level, but there's also a lot to be optimistic about. And so I think what gets me excited about retail, whether it be digital or bricks, is that optimism.
We saw so many brands, direct to consumer specifically, blow up during the height of the pandemic. I'm curious, now that it's sort of passed and we're seeing that decline, do you think it's harder or easier to launch a D2C brand now? What are your thoughts on that piece?
Well, I think you have to unpack that question. I think launching a D2C brand through the technology that exists through the Shopifys of the world, like that will always make launching a brand way more efficient and easy. I think the second part of the question is really probably what you're asking is, how do you scale that launched brand? And I think, consumers have a lot of choices. And so I advise anybody who comes to me looking to build and launch something, is like, you never want to be a dream killer, but there are a lot of brands out there, and it's really making sure you have a distinct point of view and you're really offering something super unique to the consumer. Because what I love about both of the businesses I've launched have been sort of first mover advantage and product market exclusivity, and that piece of it has made all the other challenges, look, everything's challenging, but I didn't have one-to-one competition. And I think when you launch a bigger, better, whatever it may be, that inherent competitive landscape to me is very challenging.
We already talked a little about that 80-20 split that I mentioned off the top, but and you just brought up a lot of other issues that are sort of percolating today. Yeah, I get to interact with young people on the regular. It's very interesting to see the way 20, 22-year-olds are responding to the world today and their discussions of the future. You mentioned to them something about a 401k and they're like, oh, I probably won't live to 60 to retire anyway. Like it's very interesting to speak to young people today and see their perspective on things. I'm just curious what other trends you're picking up on that you're paying attention to that will drive your next business moves. Is there anything, I know we sort of hit on this a little bit, but is there anything specifically more macro that you're watching to help you determine your next business moves?
That's a really good question. And I like how you framed it from the start about it being through the lens of the younger generation. Look, I'm old. I'm like probably older than most people listening to this presentation, but I'm very tapped into the Gen Z zeitgeist, and embarrassingly or not, a lot of that has to do with my studying of TikTok. My boyfriend, who's younger than me, makes so much fun, and so many of my cultural references are, oh, I saw on TikTok, but it is the foremost relevant marketing channel we have right now. And to be engaged in it and seeing what this younger generation, what they talk about, what they're very vulnerable about, taboo conversations that as like a gay 49-year-old man, like still make me blush that these kids are talking about. And I think that generation right, has an incredible amount of power. And so when you ask what I'm paying attention to, it's that generation cares about where their dollars go. And gun to head, A or B, they're going to pick a product that resonates with sort of their stance on sort of the cultural conversation. And for me, older generations are certainly catching up, but I think when I hear and watch and see how the younger generation interacts with brand, I use that term loosely, brands, it really is about, having a meaningful affiliation with that product, and having two businesses that are rooted in the right side of brand, I think is really, really important. And that's what I would say I probably pay the most attention to.
I want to invite Ron to kind of rejoin us at this point, and hopefully if he could get everything turned on quick enough, almost to sort of pivot that question right to you, Ron, and get your thoughts on the same sort of subject matter. Like, what is really catching your eye? What is the trend? And if you want to build off of what Patrick was just saying, please feel free.
I would agree with Patrick on not only are younger generations choosing where to spend their money, they're choosing who to work for for the same reasons. And so I think they go hand in hand of it. The significant number of people whose first job is in retail, 1 out of 6, most recent data, that 1 out of 6 coming to 22-year-old people are then choosing the right brands where possible, based on the cities they live. So they very much go hand in hand. It's a recruiting effort from a business standpoint. It's a business development tool for many different reasons. And I too pay very close attention to that.
Ron, you said something interesting about being a brand or being a company where people want to work. And I don't think this is arrogance, but I don't have any problem recruiting. None. Never had a problem recruiting. And I've been through some of the hottest times of a job market. And I think you're right. I think that is based on people and alignment of sort of values represented by the company. And so for us here at 13 Loon and at 11 at DIA, I've never had an issue finding talent, ever. People are always super excited to work with these companies. And I think it says a lot about how and what people are placing a priority on.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, and similarly, as most recently as vice president of Intermix, similarly, I love the multi-brand space like 11RA because you have the ability. If I was recruiting for all of my stores all across the country, you have the ability for the ultimate kind of closet for styling. So if your passion is really styling, until a year ago, Intermix owned by Gap Inc., which is where I began. So you had extraordinary benefits. You had the power behind Gap Inc. You had an unlimited closet for styling. You had the best customers in every city we were in. That's a dream job. I could sell that job to anyone. And by the way, we had a great commission structure, and you sell $1 million and you're making a lot of money. Like I could sell that to anyone. I could find the best people in any industry to work for me because of what I could hand them as an opportunity. But the kind of just increasing hourly rates or kind of throwing something, slapping on a brand that says, now we're paying 18 instead of 16 an hour is not good enough anymore. There have to be other reasons for people to join companies. And a lot of it is around how can they as a candidate be successful, and how can I grow my career in this industry?
It's so interesting to see the parallel from both sides that you all are looking at, right? I'll just go back to the ESG term just because it's easiest, but looking from the employee side, but also looking from the product or brand side to see it. I just want to remind everybody to please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom, submit any questions you've got. I received quite a few emails this morning when the last email went out to remind people about today's event. I can't attend. Can you ask this question? So while I wait for a few to come in that way, I can throw a few at you guys. Obviously, big question around inflation, driving consumers, and I thought this was an interesting point of view on this, driving consumers to value-priced retail. Which brands do you think are best sort of situated today to take advantage of that as the inflation picture, if in fact it gets worse? Which brands do you think are really positioned well for that, was the question. So Ron, I would start with you, since you're out there on the streets taking a look at it.
So there's a brand that I had zero personal relationship with as someone that lived in downtown New York City, and that's Walmart. And as someone that now lives in campgrounds, who arrives in a city and says, where's Walmart? And have done grocery shopping there, things that I needed for the camp, for the truck, for this trailer. I've spent more money in Walmart in the last 3 months than literally I had never been inside one. I will tell you that there are fantastic Walmarts and there are mediocre Walmarts. But it's a brand, when they're really good, it's very well positioned for where we sit. And that's not only from a kind of talent attraction training culture, but also, they just announced this huge investment in recent college graduates called an emerging coach to get them to store manager jobs, which, by the way, are 200K plus jobs. And the product assortment, I've seen greatness and I've seen not great, but when it's great, I'm in there and I'm walking around and I'm looking, and having worked in fashion my whole life, I'm mesmerized by this place. And it's really, and so you understand maybe how most of this country shops. And I understand some of their political challenges, but you have to balance where people are spending their money or where they need to. And very often the only store in town is Walmart.
Yeah. Well, and the other benefit for you being on the road is that you can pull the trailer in and stay the night when you need to. They're very good about that. Patrick, how about to you? Anything? I know it's not necessarily your space, but I know you also study the industry. What are you seeing in terms of the value-based retailers?
Well, I think it's understanding the definition, one's definition of value.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you see, what I find fascinating is in the ultra luxury space, how that is, A, prices are going up, and B, consumer demand's never been higher, right? So you look at the Karens of the world, the LVMHs of the world, Hermeses of the world, like how they're continually moving product that at that price point is fascinating to me. And then I think similarly to the Walmart analogy, I think it's really about value. And what I've learned through JCPenney is, how they are as a partner and how they're hyper focused on their existing customer base. There's a really great article in the Wall Street Journal about their new CEO. And I think the clickbaity line was something like, we don't care about new customers. Obviously, that's not true, but it was less about customer acquisition, also through the lens of how we're speaking to our existing customers. And it takes a lot to acquire a customer. And once you have that customer, how are you speaking to them? How are you creating meaningful value? How are you speaking to the entire family around that customer? And I think JCPenney is really uniquely positioned right now to be speaking to the American family and providing tremendous value, also really rooted in data, to ensure that they're delivering on their promise to give their customers the best products and services available. And so I think you've got this polarizing spectrum of like the uber wealthy doubling down on luxury goods, and then really creating meaningful value for the American family.
I think the most interesting thing about what you just said is I also saw that article in the Wall Street Journal, and I also saw the clickbait. And what I was so fascinated by was, as someone who teaches marketing, it's like, this is a company that's actually paying attention to what we say to you, which is stop focusing on the top of the funnel, get into the funnel and start focusing there if you've already built your business. And even back to when they brought in the CEO from Apple, and the mistake that he made, which was so clear at the time, and I've taught this as a case study, is that he turned away from the bottom of the funnel. And it's like, what are y'all doing in Wall Street Journal? Do you have any people who understand marketing over there? Anyway, sorry, going off on a tangent. We did get a question through the Q&A button. Why the quality of clothes is so poor, especially in the US? Ron, this has kind of been your background is, you know, clothing and retail in that space. What, any thought on that?
I think it's also equally Patrick's on the brand side, but I think that's a very general statement. I don't think that it is poor quality everywhere all the time. Some of it is price dictated. I think there is very much a return to made in America as a trend, as a customer is looking for. I think there are also a lot of brands who have felt the pain of overseas production and have now tried to find ways to have things created in the US, but I don't necessarily agree with that statement. I think you have a choice as a customer of where you want to shop and how you spend your money. And if the quality is not to your liking, I would say choose another brand.
Patrick?
I don't think that necessarily means you have to spend a ton of money. Like, I think there are a lot of value-driven brands out there that are good quality.
Great.
It's also interesting, to your point, Ron, about American made. I was just in the Mississippi Delta last month. It's May, which is last month, yeah. Fascinating how many farmers are now planting cotton again. And people aren't aware of this, but in the last 20 years in the Mississippi Delta, which is where King Cotton was born and made in the US, they have largely removed cotton from the Delta, replacing it with soybeans and other more profitable things. And it was really fascinating to see the number of cotton fields being replanted. Certainly not to what it was at the turn of the century, but certainly quite a big increase from where it was when I was last there, which was pre-pandemic. So I'm kind of curious to see, and I punt this to both of you, what you think about, you know, sort of the supply chain issues, how they have pushed us back to made in America. We're looking at the microchips, which I know are coming to fashion and retail as well. You know, those manufacturing plants are being onshored. What are your thoughts on that piece of it? Ron, you brought it up, so I'll let you continue moving in that subject if you want.
So if you think back historically, the last 20 years, U.S. production, particularly in apparel, has gone down significantly. That a very, less than 10% of all apparel in the U.S. is made in the U.S. And so that there is very much a customer. I think it's the younger customer that Patrick was describing that also pays attention to where that money is being spent. And when you are in smaller cities in this country, you recognize that local production is like the financial resource for how small cities survive and thrive. And you see the decline in certain cities, but I think because of some of the challenges we face, because of maybe it's staying closer to the inventory, it's less lead time, it's smaller production lots, it's local employment. All of that is a really important part when we think about the kind of cultural pride that we have in the US, is what are we doing here, aware at the same time that there's a price for that potentially. And maybe it is buying less, maybe it is taking pressure off the system, and you buy, it's slow fashion instead of fast fashion, and you pay more attention to where you're shopping and where it's produced. I think that's it's a great way to think about how we all engage with the economy as consumers.
Patrick, do those themes scare you as a business owner? That sounds like less consumption. Less consumption, I would assume, to a business owner, might be a little scary.
I think it doesn't scare me because it's about thoughtful consumption. And the businesses I'm involved with are very thoughtful and by design. And so again, back to sort of defensibility, we have unique positioning to ensure that. But I do think slower fashion, obviously, but I also think on demand, right? Sort of the combination of technology and manufacturing. One one brand I think that's done such a great job is Bonobos through their guide shops. How I discovered that brand, which one would think through Instagram, it was actually through a guide shop. And I think if there's a way to leverage guide shops where you have that IRL sort of retail experience, that 80% we're talking about, but somehow have manufacturing efficiencies and technology on the back end to where on demand becomes more and more of a reality, I think there's something there. That to me is exciting.
And that is where we're going to have to end our discussion. I could go on for another hour with the two of you. It's super fascinating. And you know, I think our viewers are probably used to us having 3 or 4 people in an hour. And hopefully you understand why I decided to just keep it to the 2 guests today, because you have so much knowledge to bring. And it was such a fascinating conversation. I appreciate you both. Additionally, it just also occurred to me, it is Pride Month and we are 3 gay men on the screen. So this, I think, is the first time we've ever done that. Unintentional as it was, I'm happy to celebrate Pride with the 2 of you. And thank you so much for spending the hour with us and sharing your vast amounts of experience and knowledge. As everybody knows, in the next day or so, we'll send you a thank you email. It will include a link to today, and you can watch this video again. In addition, it will include an RSVP to August's panel. So you'll notice we'll skip July. I'm taking a month off from this. We'll be back in August discussing the future of Gen Alpha. Those are the youngins coming up beyond Gen Z. So of course, we'll have to talk a little bit about Gen Z as well to get to these young people. So we encourage you, of course, to come and join us for that conversation. Again, thanks to Patrick and to Ron for spending the last hour with us. And until we meet again, as always here at FIDM, we encourage you to stay inspired and have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. Thanks.
Guys.